It is my pleasure to introduce our main speaker today. Andy Hogwalk is the Interim Director of Research and Head of the Research and Statistics Groups for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He has served as Director of Household and Public Policy Research there since 2016. He's co-editor of the Liberty Street Economics blog and a co-editor of the bank's Economic Policy Review. In addition to his duties at the bank, he is a Penn Institute for Urban Research scholar and serves on the advisory board of the Journal of Regional Science. He's past chair of the North American Regional Science Council and the Federal Reserve System Committee on Regional Analysis. He is the author of over 60 peer-reviewed publications on subjects ranging from macroeconomic stabilization to household finance. His work has been cited in most major press outlets, including NPR, CNBC, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, Reuters, John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, et cetera, et cetera. Prior to joining the New York Fed, Mr. Hogwalk served as assistant professor and director of the Urban and Regional Planning Program at Princeton University. And he holds a BA from Swarthmore College and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Andy?
Okay, thanks, Hal. Boy, that sounded like a long introduction, but thank you very much. It's very nice. Okay, so I'm going to use slides. I hear that that's a new thing. I had originally been scheduled to come at a time when the inflation rate was 2%, and then I ended up getting somewhat delayed by COVID and some other circumstances. I can't remember exactly what they were, and I ended up giving my talk when the inflation rate was 6%, and the graph that I showed the inflation rate going straight up. And so I had some explaining to do last time, which I did my best. At this time, it's a little different story. Inflation is still too high, as you'll see, but it is on its way down. So that's a good sign. And we'll talk about that. But it's great to be back, and it's really always a great opportunity for me and for the Federal Reserve System to talk to business people and people who are out working in the community, because we see a lot of data, and I'm going to show you a lot of data, but really there's a lot more to the economy than the data show, and your questions and your comments will be really helpful for us. It's also true that you guys see things before it shows up in the data, so that's very helpful for us as well to see what you guys are observing. Okay, final thing I have to say as a start is that everything I say is my own view, not those of the Federal Reserve System or the New York Fed. Okay, so let's get going. I'm going to talk about three big topics today. I'll talk about the national economy and how it's doing in terms of overall activity, how the labor market's doing, and then certainly we'll spend some time on inflation. We'll talk about households and how they've been doing. They've been a really important part of the dynamics of the economy over the last couple of years, and so we'll want to spend a little time thinking about them and anything that might be a sign of trouble in the household sector. And then finally, I'll spend some time talking about the region, and in particular New Jersey and the central New Jersey area, as much as we can get specific data for those areas. I have slides to go through. I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule compared to where we expected to be, so feel free to interrupt me with questions, particularly if you don't understand something, just raise your hand, or if I'm looking the other direction, make a noise of some kind. And I'll be happy to take your questions as we go, and then I think there will be a little time for questions at the end as well. But don't hesitate to interrupt me. Okay. So with that, let's talk about the nation. Okay, so the first thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is what we call real GDP. This is gross domestic product, and this is the broadest indicator of economic activity in the country. It's adjusted for inflation, so it's sort of how much is activity rising in real terms after we correct for price increases. And you can see, this is kind of an amazing chart, because you can see what happened during the pandemic, that real GDP activity levels just fell off the table. There's never been a period like this in American history, like a nearly 10% decline in real GDP in just a couple of months, basically, as we all went home and didn't leave our houses, and the economy ground to nearly a halt. There was a very quick rebound from that decline, as you can see, starting in late 2020 and going into 2021. And now over the last year and a half or so, we've settled down into a more typical rate of GDP growth of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5% to 2%. Now, the last quarter has been a little bit of a surprise to economists because, as you know, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates quite a lot over the last couple of years, which would typically be expected to lead to a fairly substantial slowing in the economy. We did that to fight inflation for reasons you'll see in a few minutes. And that slowdown seemed to start occurring sort of in 2020, at the end of 2021 into 2022. But during 2023, the economy's actually sort of picked up a little bit. And a big reason for that is because households have in fact continued to spend money in spite of higher interest rates. So consumption, which is the largest part of the economy, has actually been quite strong over the course of the last year, and in particular in the last quarter, the third quarter of 2023. I'm giving this talk at sort of an inconvenient time for me because tomorrow is the employment release for the month of December, so we'll know a lot about the labor market in December tomorrow. There also will be some GDP releases very soon too, so some of the data are just about to be revised, and so bear with me a little bit on that. Okay, and in fact, in the last quarter for which we have data, the third quarter of 2023, the economy grew 3%. And that's fairly substantial. That's kind of above trend growth, even in a period of relatively high interest rates. So that's been a kind of surprise to the economists and to forecasters, mainly driven by the relatively strong consumer sector. Okay, off to the labor market. So here I'm going to show you two labor market indicators that we track fairly closely. We track a whole lot of other indicators in the labor market, but these are two that are well known that we track closely. So you can see that in the red line is probably the most famous economic statistic that there is, the unemployment rate. And that number was sort of trickling down from 2015 to 2020. It got to very low levels, these levels like below 4% for long periods of time. A lot of economists thought that wasn't possible, that we couldn't really run the economy that hot, the labor market that tight with such a low unemployment rate for that long without kicking off inflation. Come back to that. Then, of course, during the pandemic, unemployment rates skyrocketed as lots and lots of people lost their jobs. Many businesses shut down temporarily or permanently. Then it started to come back down again, and as of the last year or two, it's been at this relatively low level again. The last reading we have, again to be updated tomorrow, is 3.7% as of November. So that's a very low unemployment rate. And again, a little surprising given how much monetary accommodation has been withdrawn. That's the way we talk at the Fed, sorry. How much interest rates have gone up, essentially. Nonetheless, the unemployment rate has remained quite low. The second one I want to talk about is this blue line, the labor force participation rate. Now, this is sort of a measure of how many people are trying to work or actually working out of the population who are, able to work. And so that's an interesting number because it's sort of the supply of labor. It's the number of people who are available to work or trying to work. And you can see that thing is sort of pretty flat, around 63% from 2015 until the pandemic. Then it fell off the table. A lot of people just left the labor force during the pandemic. They didn't want to work for a variety of reasons. And then it sort of slowly started rebounding. That's been a slow recovering indicator, the labor force participation rate. Even now, it's not quite where it was prior to the recession that came from the pandemic. Now, that's understandable. The economy, the population, I should say, is aging a little bit over this time period. And so you might expect more people would retire. So it's not surprising that it's a little bit lower. It's quite close now to where it was prior to the pandemic. And so we sort of think that this is a sign. This chart looks like a pretty healthy, healed labor market. There was a big imbalance between demand and supply for labor for a long time as people stopped working. That really seems to be going away. The labor market, we would say, is healing, and this is an indicator that we're sort of getting back to where we expect things to be in the labor market. And that's the indicator there. Okay, so now to inflation. So here I show two measures of inflation. There's the total inflation measure that we have here is from the PCE deflator. PCE stands for personal consumption expenditures. So this is sort of the prices faced by households as they go out to supermarkets and gas stations and the whole list of places that people buy things. The core PCE deflator, the red line, is the whole price bundle, the whole consumption bundle, taking out food and energy. Now, of course, food and energy are important things that people need. They need to eat. They need to heat their homes, drive their cars. We take it out because those are volatile prices, and if you want to sort of see where inflation is really heading, it's better, it's easier, it's a better measure to take out the most volatile things that bounce up and down a whole lot from month to month. So that's why we look at the core measure quite a lot at the Fed. Nonetheless, the total and the core move together in some broad sense, as you can see over this time period. So, two things to say. I think I was here I guess it was 2 years ago, so it must have been something like January of 2022, and you can see that was not a good time for a Fed person to be giving a talk about inflation. Inflation rate was, right around 6 or 7%. It got up even a little higher. It got up close to 8% in the summer of 2022, so maybe it wasn't the absolute worst time for me to be here. But since then, with the withdrawal of monetary accommodation or the increasing in interest rates from the Fed, also, frankly, the relaxation of some supply constraints around the economy and around the world, that's led the inflation rate to start coming down. And it's coming down actually now quite quickly, as you can see. The most recent reading here, I think, is about, on the total, is like 2.6%, something like that. So it's not quite where we want it because the Fed has a target inflation rate for this blue line of 2%. And you can see that we were doing okay at the 2% target between 2016 and 2020-ish, although we were having trouble getting it up to 2%. Remember those days? That was seems funny in retrospect. But then, of course, it went up very, very high, and we have a ways to go to get it back to 2%. But that's where we're heading, is 2%. Yeah. I didn't think I'd get through the inflation point without any questions, so I'm ready. Oh, those are great questions. So let me take the first one first. What we would call the natural rate of unemployment would be the rate that we would think the economy can keep this rate of unemployment without inflation rising or without going into a recession. So it's sort of the lowest we can get it without kicking off inflation. That's the idea. And views of what that number is have evolved over time. And there is no one Federal Reserve view either, I should say. But somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5% to 4% is probably what most economists would say. That people, when I was in grad school, I think people said that number's 5 or 5.5%. So it's come down quite a lot. We've run the economy at a pretty tight level for a long time now. But somewhere in the 3.5% to 4% range. So that's number one. The second one is why 2%? That's a hard question, actually, because obviously, why not 1.95? That's actually, I couldn't answer that question. But let me try to put it in a sort of why not some other number? Why not 0? A lot of people wonder, why would you want any inflation at all? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, a little bit of inflation is a good thing because it allows people to be able to change their prices around without having it become a huge issue. It allows people to be able to reduce the costs of their employees without cutting their nominal wages, which is very, very difficult to do. So you can keep nominal wages fixed, but real wages fall a little bit with inflation. And from the Fed's perspective, if the inflation rate is 0, it's very easy for it to go below 0. And that's a huge problem for us because then the monetary policy tools that we have don't really work correctly when inflation is negative. And so it's very hard to get an economy out of a negative inflation environment, deflationary environment. So we don't want the inflation rate to be too close to 0 for that reason. That's kind of an invitation to disaster. So why 2% instead of 1.5 or 2.5? It's a number that the public can sort of understand. It's kind of not so high, but it's not too close to 0. So that's kind of the idea. Any other questions about inflation? Okay, so that was my national summary. Real GDP growth has been slowing. We expect to start slowing in Q4 and through 2024. So I mentioned that it has sort of picked up a lot in 2023. We sort of expect that over the course of the current, well, not the current quarter anymore, the quarter that ended December 31st, and the current year, 2024, that higher interest rates and tight financial conditions will continue to sort of weigh down on the economy and slow things down. We haven't seen that much of that yet. I've been saying that for a while, and it hasn't slowed the economy that much yet, but we expect that it'll start to take more hold now. The labor market's continuing to rebalance. As I mentioned, I think we're sort of getting close to a rebalanced labor market, more like normal conditions there. And inflation is returning to what we would consider mandate consistent levels, that is close to 2%. Now, these are not the same conclusions I had the last time I was here, because inflation was on its way up. Now I can feel pretty confident that there's a lot of reasons to think that inflation will continue its downward moves. Okay. Let's talk about households for a little while. In particular, I want to talk about households' use of debt. And that's been an important factor in the way the economy has evolved over the last couple of years. And it's a specialty of my little group, so I like to spend a little time on that. So this is the total amount of debt outstanding that households owe in the United States. We have data from a credit bureau that's completely anonymized. We don't know who the people are, but we're able to estimate how much money is outstanding in these various forms of debt. You can see here that the orange bars at the bottom are mortgage debt, and that's overwhelmingly the most important part of household debt. It's about 70% of household debt outstanding. People are also interested in the red, which used to be very small and is now very large. That's student debt, which has gotten quite big. Credit cards are in blue, and auto loans are in green. So debt has grown actually quite sharply since the beginning of the pandemic. In particular, mortgage debt grew a lot during the housing boom that occurred during the pandemic, and I'll show you a little bit of data on that. And now debt outstanding as at the end of the third quarter was a little over $17 trillion. So that's a big number, a lot of money owed by households in the form of these various debts. Now here's an interesting chart that shows what's happened in the mortgage market, which is closely related to what's happened in the housing market and Fed policy. So these are dollars of mortgages originated in each quarter since 2003 Q1. And the bar colors reflect people of different credit scores. So the light blue ones at the top are the people with the very highest prime credit scores. So they originate the vast, especially in the pandemic period, originated the great majority, actually, of mortgages that were originated during the pandemic. Now, why is that? Because a lot of mortgages originated during the pandemic were refis. People refinanced their mortgage. Remember interest rates being like 2%? So many people, many homeowners refinanced their mortgages. That had a lot of advantages for them and led to tailwinds for the economy right now. Advantage number one, reduce your monthly payment. And so all that money that's freed up from, you used to send it in your mortgage check, now you can go out and take a vacation or eat dinner in a restaurant. And so that's a nice tailwind for consumers and has helped to support the economy as we've gone through this period of higher interest rate. That money is already locked in. They've already got that advantage. A second thing is a lot of people took cash out. They cashed in some of the equity in their homes, so they borrowed a little bit more. And that money is available for spending on various kinds of consumer items. So that is another thing that has been a tailwind or sort of a source of support to the economy. These are great because we've raised interest rates a lot. And many people, and I would even say most people, thought the economy was going to go into a recession. And that, some people varied about whether they thought that was a worthwhile trade-off to get inflation down to cause a recession. It looks like that we are getting to a point where we can say the economy is not going into a recession, it's still continuing to grow, and the inflation rate is coming down. So and part of the reason for that is this mortgage borrowing by households. One thing you can notice also is that there's no more mortgage refinance. Nobody's refinancing a mortgage anymore because interest rates are 7%. So everybody refinanced, in 2021, and that's dried up. Another small thing to mention here is that the great majority of mortgage credit that's been originated over the last several years has been to people with really high credit scores. So that's advantageous when you worry about financial stability. Are we going to have another repeat of the 2007 to 2009 housing crisis? Well, at least from the point of view of the quality of the borrowers as measured by their credit score, it's a very different situation from the prior period. If you look to the left of this chart, you can see much more dark blue and yellow there, which were lower credit score borrowers. So there's much less subprime, almost no subprime borrowing now in the mortgage market. Here's a similar chart for auto loans, and I just wanted to point this out because auto loans originations have just continued to chug along. Even though the interest rates have gone up, people have continued to borrow a lot, and it's across the board, across the credit spectrum. High credit score borrowers, low credit score borrowers, everybody's borrowing to pay for their cars. One of the reasons is cars have gotten really, really expensive in the course of the pandemic. As used car prices come down, that might put a little downward pressure on these auto originations. But again, the flows of credit have been a support to households as they try to realize their consumption plans. That's Fed speak again. Okay. This is a chart on delinquencies. So what we're looking at here is the percentage of all the different now. And as you can see, the delinquency rate is starting to go up. And in fact, it's now higher than it was prior to the pandemic. That's a warning sign. I see a few cringes in the audience, and that is something that we're concerned about. That's a sign of stress in the household sector, at least for the segment that has a big credit card debt and struggles to make those payments. That's worrisome, and so we're closely monitoring that, keep paying attention to that. You can see auto loans, a similar kind of story. Not quite as dramatic a rebound there, and it hasn't gone above its prior pre-pandemic level yet, but it's still going up. And so that's another thing that we're concerned about. So auto loans and credit cards, and these are the debts that are held by younger and less well-off people. These are people who seem to be facing a little bit of stress as interest rates have gone up. That's starting to bind a little bit in these households. We got to watch that. This chart shows foreclosures in the blue bars and bankruptcies in the red bars. You can see that during the pandemic, foreclosures went very close to zero. Foreclosing on a mortgage was almost illegal in most parts of the country during the pandemic. Bankruptcies fell too. Courts were closed. It was hard to go bankrupt. Plus, people had lots of resources to avoid bankruptcy. They both started to tick up again, in particular foreclosures, but they still remain below their prior levels. And that's true for bankruptcies as well. So that's a sign that even though there's some evidence here that these delinquencies are starting to cause more trouble, we haven't seen the worst outcomes yet. We haven't seen foreclosures and bankruptcies spiking as they did during the great financial crisis, for example. So that's a good sign. Okay, so borrowing has supported household spending during 2022 and 2023. Originations are beginning to slow, especially for mortgages, and delinquency increases signal that we're seeing some distress for some kinds of households in particular. We got to keep our eyes on that. That's something important to watch. Okay, off to the region. So this is a chart of current economic conditions as reported by respondents to 2 New York Fed surveys. Those of you who were here the last time I talked may remember we have a survey of manufacturers in New York State. That's called the Empire State Manufacturing Survey, and that's the light blue measure here. And we have something that's called the Business Leaders Survey. That's a survey of all industries outside of manufacturing located in New York or New Jersey, or Fairfield, Connecticut, which is also part of our district. So the Business Leaders Survey would cover New Jersey, and it would cover this area, and would cover many industries other than manufacturing. So what we ask them every month is, how are conditions now compared to their usual state at this time of year? And so this is the share that say they're better than usual minus the share that say they're worse than usual. Okay, so that's what this number is. So when this number is positive, that suggests that people think things are pretty good. And when it's negative, they think things are not so good. So you can see during the pandemic, not so good, really, really not so good, even worse than the Great Recession. Coming out of the pandemic, manufacturers came out quite quickly and quite well. As you may know, goods consumption is still way up compared to prior to the pandemic. Services, a slower recovery, but nonetheless a recovery that got underway really by 2021. So in 2021, we saw both goods manufacturers and service providers doing pretty well, thinking that conditions were quite good. Then in 2020, starting in 2022, the Fed starts raising interest rates, taking away the punch bowl, as they say, and the conditions start to weaken. So right now, over the last year and a half, both the manufacturers, these are noisy measures. Obviously, it's a monthly thing, and so it's a noisy measure. But both the manufacturers and the service firms report that conditions are not as good as usual. That things are weak. So it's kind of a slow period here in our region. Okay, so now let's look at that's a measure. So we don't have great measures of activity at the regional level. Measures of activity are mostly at the national level. So that's the best measure we've got of activity at our region. But we do have good labor measures at the regional level. So I'm going to talk about how the labor force has been doing at the regional level. So this is a map of the United States, as you probably recognize. And what I'm showing here is how unemployment rates in each state compare to the national average. So the blue states are at least 1 percentage point below the U.S. unemployment rate. The red ones are at least 1% more than the U.S. New Jersey's in that group, as you can see. And the gray ones, which is the great majority, are within 1% of the U.S. So they're somewhere pretty close to the U.S. So it's a little bit unusual for so many states to be so close to the U.S. In a period of a slowing economy, which we've sort of had in many states, it's unusual for the states to be so clustered around the U.S. And even New Jersey, which is red for being 1 or more points above the United States, is exactly 1.0 percentage points above the United States. So it's as close as you can be. And next month it might be back in the gray camp. So there aren't very many states that are diverging from the nation. That's just kind of a little bit of an interesting phenomenon right now. We know why New Jersey's a little slow.
Do we know why there's so many that are?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it really says, I think, is that the economy is kind of good around the country in terms of the labor market's pretty tight just about everywhere. Um, why is that the case? I mean, I think the consumers have been pretty buoyant across the country. House prices went up just about everywhere, not quite everywhere, as we'll see. But that was a source of support for consumers across the country, and that's supported, local businesses all over. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that's happening. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Oh, yeah.
So everywhere you go, everyone you talk to, labor is everyone's thorn in their side. Is there any understanding at this point as to what's causing that?
Tight, hard to hire workers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. One thing is that the labor force participation rate for the nation is not quite back to where it was. A second thing is that you'll see in New Jersey, that's kind of especially true, actually. I have that chart, I'm pretty sure. I can show it to you, so we'll come back to that. But yeah, I mean, overall, we think that labor's become a little bit more plentiful. The unemployment rate has ticked up a little bit. The labor force participation rate has gone up a little bit. But it still sounds like, at least from your perspective, the labor market's really tight. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So here are unemployment rates in New York City, New Jersey, and the U.S. The U.S. is in black, New York City is in blue, and New Jersey in red. And this is over the time period since 1990. One of the reasons I show this is to just show how closely integrated New York and New Jersey tend to be. New York City, like New Jersey is really connected to New York City. And of course, there's a huge cycle in both the region and the nation. And again, this amazing spike in the unemployment rate in 2020, in the early part of 2020. It got even worse in New York. Of course, the unemployment rate almost reached 18%. I think it did reach 18% at 1 month there during 2020 in New York City. 15% or so in the nation as a whole. Now you can see New Jersey has followed the nation as its unemployment rate has come down, and New Jersey's, as you see, it just recently ticked up to 1% above the nation, but it's been pretty close to the nation for the last couple of years, in fact. New York City has not recovered all the way. New York City has, still got a pretty high unemployment rate relative to where it was pre-pandemic, and relative to its recent history. The U.S. now at 3.7, New Jersey at 4.7. New York State is actually below New Jersey, and New York City's way up at 5.3%. Okay, so here's some job trends. Now this figure shows where things stand in November relative to where they stood just before the pandemic in February of 2020. So here, blue means you're more than 5% above where you were prior to the pandemic. Deep red means you're more than 5% below where you were prior to the pandemic. Actually, there are no more states now in the deep red. It's all the reds are all, well, maybe Hawaii. I'm sorry, Hawaii remains more than 5% below where it started. The other red states are down 0 to 5%, and then the grays again are sort of within the sort of close to up a little bit, like the U.S. as a whole. And you can see that there's clusters of states in the south and in the mountain region where the rebound from the pandemic is really quite complete. And then there's some states in the northern tier in particular where the rebound from the pandemic is not complete. And New York State and New York City are in that camp of non-complete rebounds. And you can see that here again. Here we've got the same figure. This is a comparison between February of 2020 and all the other periods. So if you look to the right, the November number for New Jersey, the red line, is a little above the 0 line, meaning it's about 5% above, or 4.5%, something like that, above where we were prior to the pandemic. You can't see the U.S. line because it's underneath the New Jersey line. I mean, it's like really right on top of the nation. So New Jersey has been performing really close to the national average through much of the pandemic recovery. New York City and New York State in particular are not recovering as quickly and are still below the rest of the country, and New York, in the case of New York State, below where it was prior to the pandemic. Okay, and here's a similar thing for this area, for Mercer County. That's the Trenton MSA. I also put in Camden to give a sense of how it compares to Camden. You can see that, again, well, not again. In the case of Trenton and Camden, we've actually done a little bit better than the rest of the country and the rest of New Jersey by extension. So we're a little above the black line here at the end. And that tells us that this recovery we've been doing a little bit better here than the rest of the nation, which is kind of perhaps a surprise. It's a little bit true that when you look at city areas, urban areas, the centers have been weak and the outskirts have been stronger. And that's, got to do with work from home. Those of you who, run restaurants or something may have recognized that there's like more people here at lunch than there used to be because people like me are here instead of in New York City. And so there's a whole dynamic sort of spatial reordering of activity that's going on. And you can see that in one way or another in a lot of these data. Here's in orange, Middlesex, Monmouth, and Ocean counties combined. And you can see, again, a little better than the nation as a whole, a little better than the rest of New Jersey as well.